Hello friends! A few months have come and gone and I am back with Chewy to talk about the books I read in the last 2 months. I didn't do a wrap up at the end of June, in part because so much was happening in my life. It's ridiculous. I had so many fires to put out, metaphorically. I was also fighting a bit of a reading slump because of some of the books that I read and or attempted to read in June and July. We'll talk about it. We'll get there. I just wanted to talk to you about all the books I finished in June and July. Make sure that I have a chance to talk about every single book here on my channel, especially the books that I haven't included in a separate video. But of course, many of the books that I read are included in reading vlogs or are brought up in other videos, or I make video essays or standalone reviews of them. So I will try to be a little bit more concise about those books at least. And I will use my symbols and sound effects combo that I've been doing lately. So this symbol and sound effect for when a book is included in a reading vlog or has a longer review in another video. And you can check out the description box for all of those links. And I will play this sound effect when the book card is on the screen, which is my little summary page with content warnings and genre, age demographic, representation notes, all those things. Of course, I also have my book cards database, which I am trying to stay on top of. I'm a little bit behind right now, but it is linked in the description box. It's that as a reference, and I will try to get caught up at least to the end of July so that we're up to date for this video. But I think that's enough housekeeping. I read 20 books in June and July, 11 books in June and 9 in July, if I'm remembering correctly. So I might as well get started because there's a lot to talk about. Starting with June, and the first book I finished in June, Spoiled Milk by Avery Curran. This is a gothic horror set in 1920s England at a boarding school, and our protagonist is in her final year. She's 17, on the cusp of 18, and at the very start of the novel, her best friend, the center of her universe, dies unexpectedly on the eve of her 18th birthday, and things only escalate from there. This was absolutely fantastic. It's sapphic, it's thematically rich, it is gory at times, it is spooky and unsettling. It has so much atmosphere, and it's a very evocative exploration of queerness and coming of age and coming to terms with who you are and finding that side of yourself, and maybe a messier look at what that could be like through our protagonist's eyes, who is quite angry at the fact that she's having to have these feelings and deal with them, while also being quite angry that the boarding school that has been her home for so long seems to want to kill her and all of her friends now. So I mean, I went into this hoping to enjoy it, of course, and I came away so impressed that this is a debut, and there are moments where you can sense that, but overall it is such an impressive first novel. It was so much fun. It was so engaging and intense and funny at times, and if you don't mind unlikable characters, and you don't mind some ambiguity, and you don't mind very messy depictions of coming of age and coming to terms with queerness, I would highly recommend this. I thought this was so fantastic, and I'll definitely be keeping an eye out for Avery Curran in the future. I can't wait to see what she writes next. So 5 stars for Spoiled Milk. Next up was our May book club pick that I reread right before our meeting, Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi. And this was kind of cosmic timing, I think, because the author passed the same week that we had our discussion, and I was actively in the middle of my reread when I saw the news, and it added an immediacy to this because this does chronicle Marjane's childhood and teenage years in Iran, predominantly right before and during and after the Iranian Revolution. She's in Tehran right in the middle of everything, and she witnessed this shift from prior and post-revolution and the significant reduction in women's rights, and as a girl experiencing that herself even before she'd reached adulthood, and how that impacted her. And this is in graphic novel form, and the first time I read this, I think, was the first time that I ever read a graphic novel memoir, and I quickly realized how great this medium is for memoirs. I think the artwork, especially when the artwork is done by the author whose life it is about, it just adds so much that can't necessarily, I mean, it can be conveyed in words, of course. Almost everything can be conveyed in words, but sometimes there's a subtlety, there is an extra layer of subtext, there is an extra layer of emotion that can be conveyed in images that is harder to achieve through language. And I remember being really affected by the art the first time, and that definitely was the case again on this reread. I actually think on a reread, I appreciated it even more. And I think it's also highly relevant to world events right now, this year. The influence of external countries or world powers is not the main focus of this story. It is predominantly about Marjan's experience and her growing up, her coming of age, her understanding of her world, and the way that her world shifted so significantly in her formative years and how that impacted her and her family and the trajectory of her life. However, it is touched on at times, and I do think, again, based on recent events, it becomes even more visceral to read this and to experience a first-hand account, especially knowing that Marjan just passed and at a pretty young age. I believe she was in her 50s. So it was an emotional read the first time as well, but this time I think it hit me even harder. Even just being a few years older, I think it impacted me in a different way and would have regardless. But it was a very intense read, a very emotional read, and our discussion was really fruitful and fascinating, as our book club discussions tend to be, because the people in the book club are amazing. But I would highly recommend this if you haven't read Persepolis. This edition that I have is both part 1 and part 2. It is a memoir in 2 parts, and some editions they come separately, and in some, like the one I have, it's all in one. I would recommend reading both part 1 and part 2 because they're both vital pieces of Marjan's story. I would highly recommend it. Even if you're not much of a memoir person, I'm not much of a memoir person, but this is definitely one of the best memoirs I have ever read. So 5 stars for Persepolis. Then I read a book that I've talked about in a couple recent videos, so you might have already heard my thoughts on it, as well as it being in a reading vlog. The Girl with a Thousand Faces by Sanyi Dean. This is a fantasy novel, but it does have horror elements to it. It is a very dark fantasy, not a gothic fantasy, but a dark fantasy with dark subject matter and horror elements for sure. I think if you're a horror reader, this won't read like horror to you, but if you never read horror and are more a fantasy reader, you might feel the horror a little bit more intensely. However, this is an absolutely fascinating book, and it's one of those books where upon completion, I had some criticisms, I had some things that were not fully quite clicking for me, and I ended up giving it 4 stars, but it's one of those books that just keeps lingering. I keep thinking about it. It keeps coming back to me. And I already had a sense pretty early on that it might end up being one of those books that I go back and revise my rating. And the more time that passes, the more I feel that might happen. I am getting very close to bumping this up to 5 stars despite my few qualms. So this is a historical fantasy set in China during the Japanese occupation of Hong Kong during World War II. And it is fantasy, so it's not totally historically accurate, but it is based on real history, and it is attempting to use fantasy and also supernatural elements like ghosts and other Chinese mythology inspired supernatural creatures to explore the lingering grief and trauma from the mass civilian casualties during the occupation. And this really felt like a love story from Sanyi Dean to part of her heritage, to part of her family, and to experiences that family members had. Also a love story to Chinese mythology. I thought it was really beautiful. It is very watery. I included it in my atmospheric summer recommendations video in the waterlogged category because it's just so wet in the best way. It is very dark. It's very spooky. It has a bit of an unusual, surprising, interesting storytelling structure. It doesn't follow conventions of the genre necessarily. Also, a pretty significant portion of this book is told in second person, which I know a lot of people hate. As with some other books that I've really enjoyed that use second person narration, like The Fifth Season, there's always a reason. And there's a reason here too. It's not just a random choice. However, I know that some people really hate it, so I think it's important to bring it up when I talk about this book, that if you can't stand second-person narration, you're not going to want to read this. However, if you're a bit on the fence with it, or if you've had a bad time with it in the past, but you're willing to try, I would recommend this book, because I do think it is emotional, it is poignant, it's fascinating, it's engaging. The characters are incredibly interesting and very complicated and layered and surprising, and the way the story is told is just so unusual, and it really kept me totally entranced, in part because I was so sort of thrown off my equilibrium because it was so uncommon in terms of the structure. We have multiple points of view and we have multiple timelines, but instead of alternating one to the other, going through them in a more methodical way or trying to keep it pretty even all the way throughout. We spend a chunk in one time period with one character, we spend another chunk from a different point of view in a different time period, and it's all quite separated out into different sections of the novel. And in some ways, I think that was the greatest weakness of the novel, but it was also simultaneously kind of its greatest strength. I think this novel is so interesting, and I want more people to read it because I want to have more discussions about it. And if you want a much longer, more in-depth review, including spoiler sections that you can either watch or skip, up to you, then definitely check out the reading vlog, because I think this is a hard one to review concisely because there's just so much to say. Would recommend. Then I read a book that I have talked about once in my mid-year freakout tag because unfortunately it is one of my greatest disappointments of the year so far, and I am just as upset about it as any of you might be. Brigands and Breadknives by Travis Baldree. It's part of a cozy fantasy series, the third book in the series so far. I say cozy with air quotes because to me this particular installment did not feel cozy, which was part of where my disappointment came from. I will try to keep it brief, in part because again I've already ranted about it a little bit in another video, but this is following Fern again, who was not in the first installment but was part of the prequel. And Fern has been a bookseller for a very long time, and the premise is that she has kind of felt like she needs a change, and the idea was that she would leave her bookstore that she had been running for a very long time in the coastal town where she met Viv in the prequel, and that she would travel to set up shop next to Legends and Lattes, the coffee shop that Viv sets up in the first book, and that she and her friend would be able to, you know, hang out, have neighboring shops, and she could continue to be a bookseller, but maybe, you know, have a change of pace, live in a new place, new beginnings. And that's how it starts. And then very quickly things go off the rails. And most of the story is not about that. Most of the story does not take place anywhere close to any of the characters we've gotten to know. It's all brand new characters other than Fern. There is way less coziness, way less low stakes, friends doing things together, which is also why a lot of people really don't like this series. But it's what I go to this series for. It's what I appreciated about it, that it had complicated, layered characters, and that it was exploring those characters deeply and looking at interesting themes while also having this low stakes, cozy, sort of heartwarming setting. And in this book, I felt like we not only got less rich character development than I expected and had come to look forward to from the other books in the series. Even for Fern herself, I feel like she had a more layered portrayal and more interesting character development in the first book that she was in, the prequel, than this book, even though this is her book. But also that it just wasn't cozy. There's a lot of fight scenes, there's a lot of action, and where I thought it was going is not where it went at all. And I found the ending deeply unsatisfying, personally. While I understand that it's meant to be a bit of a midlife crisis book, I cannot forgive Fern for her treatment of pot roast, and the way the book ended made it even worse for me. So, I mean, I will, if another book comes out in the series, and I believe there are plans, I will give it a try, but my expectations have definitely dropped quite a bit after this experience. This was not what I wanted from this series at all. I found it very disappointing. I also found it kind of boring for a lot of the book. I actually tried to read it twice and put it down, and then eventually forced myself to finish it in June. I'm not sure it was worth it, to be honest. I gave it 2 stars. I'm sorry to this man, Travis Baldree. You seem like a great guy. You're an awesome narrator. The first 2 books I loved so much. I hope you can pull it out of the bag again in the future. I'm also sorry to you if you love this book. However, I do not agree. That's okay. Share your thoughts in the comments if you've read this series, if you've read Brigands and Breadknives. Did you like it better than I did? I'm unlikely to change my mind, but I am curious to read yours. Then I read The Raven Scholar by Antonia Hodgson. I have a dedicated reading vlog for this one, so go check that out. So much detail, so much detail. However, one thing that I did forget to talk about in terms of this fantasy novel that I will say it's being sold as epic fantasy or even dark academia fantasy. It feels somewhat academic because of who our protagonist is. However, it is not in an academic setting, and also it is not dark at all, nor is it epic fantasy. I mean, it's fantasy, it has a magic system, and so on. However, it is very comedic in tone, and I think the cover and the description threw a lot of people off for what to expect going into this. This is a pretty silly book. However, I found it very fun. But one thing that I should mention that I forgot to talk about at all in my long review, mostly because I didn't realize I hadn't talked about it in an earlier update, and then in the last update I thought I'd already talked about it, so I didn't talk about it again, but I actually hadn't talked about it the first time. Anyways, I love Soul. Some of you in the comments were very upset that I didn't talk about Soul. Soul was fantastic. I thought Soul was hilarious. I really enjoyed Soul. I'm not going to say who that is for anyone who hasn't read it because I don't want to spoil you. But yes, I did love Soul. For those of you who are upset that I forgot to mention them, they were great as well. But I have seen, this is having polarizing reactions for people. I think because it was sold as sort of an epic, dark academia, serious fantasy. It's a bit of a tome, and the premise feels very traditional, almost YA fantasy with a competition. Basically, the emperor has finished their term and needs to choose a successor. And in this land, in this society, they don't have a hereditary passing of power. They do a series of trials to select the next emperor. And our protagonist, who was not in the running nor interested in being in the running, gets pulled into the running against her will and has to compete to be the next empress despite not having prepared and not being interested in doing so. And it is a series of trials and also simultaneously a murder mystery to try to figure out who murdered the contender whose place she has taken. And, people are having mixed reactions in part because the tone is very different. It is very sort of silly and kind of over the top at times, and very much many characters joking, many jokes, much silliness. I enjoyed that. I thought it was pretty funny. I have also seen a lot of people not get along with our protagonist, Nima. I thought she was really fun. I liked her. I could relate to her in a lot of ways. I feel she's very heavily neurodivergent coded, and as a neurodivergent myself, I felt I could relate to her. She is very bookish, and she is capable in her own very narrow lane, but she is forced through the entire book to be very much outside of her lane, and she is not as capable outside of her lane. And I think that also is something that a lot of people didn't enjoy. It felt like she wasn't smart enough or she wasn't capable enough. I honestly am kind of the opposite, where I'm so sick of characters who are just good at everything, even things that they've never done before and have never trained in and have no right to be good at. And so the fact that she, as someone who has never investigated a murder, is not that great at investigating a murder seems realistic to me. The fact that she, who did not train nor plan to be in these trials, is not necessarily the best at the trials also feels realistic to me. However, I know that for a lot of people, it did not land the same way. But I had fun with it. I had a pretty good time. I did have some critiques. You can watch the reading vlog for so much more detail, and you can see all my critiques there. I agree that the humor at times leaned a little bit more juvenile. However, overall, I found it pretty funny. And I actually thought that the character work was the best part of this novel. And the characters felt like adults to me, just dramatic adults with big personalities and lots of different kinds of personalities that you don't always see depicted in fantasy, especially epic fantasy, if you want to call it that. Your mileage may vary. I don't know if you'll like this because I don't know what your taste is like, but I would definitely recommend checking out the reading vlog for more details if you're on the fence, because it is hard to talk about all the many aspects of this without spending quite a bit more time. And you can, again, skip over those spoilers if you don't want to be spoiled, or if you've read this and you want to hear all the nitty-gritty details, feel free. But yes, I did forget to talk about Soul in the full review, so I apologize. But Soul is fun, and I enjoyed them immensely. Okay. That is The Raven Scholar. I give it 4 stars. Next I read Whoever You Are, Honey by Olivia Gatwood. And this one is a bit of a harder book to define. It's a bit of a genre-bending novel. Literary fiction is probably primarily where I would place it, but it does have some speculative elements to it, or possibly speculative elements. It is one of those books that does not give you concrete answers for everything. So again, your mileage may vary, obviously, on any book ever. But especially here, there are definitely aspects of this that I personally wanted more answers for, even as someone who has, I would say, a pretty high tolerance for not getting answers. It doesn't necessarily bother me in general to have things left open. I often actually prefer to be able to infer things and come to my own conclusions. However, in this novel, we spent so much time with the is she, isn't she, did he, didn't he, of it all, and I shall not elaborate further to avoid spoilers. I wanted a little bit more of an answer than we got. I found the ending of this one pretty unsatisfying, personally. However, most of the novel I enjoyed so much. I thought it was so beautifully written. I thought it was fascinating and eerie and strange, very atmospheric. This is another one that I included in my atmospheric summer reads video. And it is also a debut novel, so I felt like I was able to give it a little bit more grace, but I was disappointed by the ending. I did reread the last couple chapters hoping that somehow there would be more that I missed. but there wasn't. There wasn't. I should give you the premise of this. This is a book about Mitty, who is living in Santa Cruz with her elderly roommate who owns a house in Santa Cruz, and she's moved in with her. They've lived together for 10 years, and Mitty's in her early 30s, I believe. And their neighborhood is being gentrified. A lot of rich tech people are moving in. And next door, the house has been empty for a long time. It was renovated, turned into this, demolished and rebuilt into this glass dollhouse, as they call it. And this rich tech mogul has moved in next door with his perfect girlfriend, who is the most beautiful, most impeccable woman that Mitty has ever seen. And Mitty develops an immediate crush on her, and also quickly becomes suspicious because her neighbors, especially her female neighbor, Lena, is acting a little strange. And they eventually meet, they develop this friendship, this connection, they sort of become intertwined. Lena hasn't had a lot of female friends or friends in general, so she sort of latches on to Mitty, and Mitty has also been isolated for a long time, mostly from her own choice based on her past, and so she also is drawn to Lena, both because she has a crush on her, but also because she has been pretty lonely with only her roommate Bethel for company. And we slowly unravel Mitty's backstory and why she has been self-isolating. We slowly unravel Lena's deal, why she is both so perfect and yet so strange. And I thought it was a really interesting examination of female friendship, of female desire, of both desiring as a woman, but also being the object of desire as a woman, heavy on the object and the objectification of women and playing the role and being the perfect girlfriend or the perfect woman and what that means and the weight of that. There's also a lot here to do with memory and personhood and identity and how your memory and your experiences are tied to who you are, and how much of you lives in your past and how much of you lives in your current day choices. And again, it was so beautifully written, so atmospheric. So even though there were some things that I wanted answers to that we didn't get, that I found a bit frustrating, and I didn't love the ending as much as I wanted to, I still had a really great time with this and found it absolutely obsessively engaging. I could barely put it down while I was reading it, and I ended up giving it 4 stars. Then in June, I read the book that I've probably talked about the most on my channel in the last couple months, so I'm going to be so brief about this because y'all don't need to hear me talk about this again. The Safekeep by Yael van der Wadden. This is set in the Netherlands in the 60s, and it is sapphic, and it is our protagonist Isabel coming to terms with her identity, her sexuality. This one also is heavily to do with memory and legacy and belonging and family and ownership and connection and desire. And I not only read this for a dedicated reading vlog, I also just put out a video essay where I use this as the primary example and talk about it a lot because I still had thoughts and feelings. And I also brought it up in, I believe, multiple other videos in between. So I've already talked about this a lot, but I thought it was absolutely stunning. I was so entranced by it. It's my favorite book that I've read all year so far. I found it deeply moving. I found it so intense. It just made me feel such a wide spectrum of emotions. I found it shocking at moments. I found it endearing at others. It made me flustered. It made me blush during the intimate scenes. I found it so richly layered and complex and absolutely fascinating, and I loved it so much, and it's beautiful, and I can't stop thinking about it, which is why I keep talking about it all the time. But please check out the reading vlog for much more detailed thoughts, because I can't let myself talk about it any longer, otherwise I will probably rave about it for an hour, and no one needs that. I've already talked about this book literally for hours on my channel, so I'll link those down below. But beautiful, fantastic, amazing, wonderful. Loved it so much. We'll be talking about it again in the future, guaranteed. So just prepare yourself. 5 stars for the Safekeep. Then next up, I read a book that I'm kind of hesitant to review, mostly because my expectations were so high for this. I had had this recommended to me so many times over the years. I have had people specifically request that I read this book. I've had people tell me over and over again that this was going to be right up my alley. I've seen people compare this to so many books that I've loved, and it didn't quite work for me, and I'm still really sad about it. Part of me wonders if I just read it at the wrong time. Like I said already, I was sort of on the edge of a reading slump through both of these months. I tried to read and had to put down multiple books. None of them are official DNFs, so I'm not including them in this video as DNFs, but I started many books that I just could not continue with. I think I might not have been in the best place to read this. I thought that it was going to sort of kick me out of my reading slump and be amazing and incredible and a new favorite, and I was going to have so much fun and it would fix everything. But instead, I think maybe I wasn't able to appreciate it because of where I was at. So all of that caveat to say, please don't hate me, but this was not as much my cup of tea as I'd hoped for, and I might try it again in the future when I'm in a more calm, relaxed place. The book I'm talking about is a memory called Empire by Arkady Martine. This is my first time reading any Arkady Martine. I've had their books recommended to me many, many times. This book specifically, many times. This is science fiction, and our protagonist is an ambassador who has been put through this procedure where you essentially take on the memories and experiences of another person and carry that forward with you, and she takes on the memories and experiences of the previous ambassador, travels from the station where she lives to this planet where the emperor lives and is an ambassador to the emperor. And when she gets there, things are not quite the way she expected them to be. There are things that the former ambassador was not forthright about. There seems to be some sort of unrest going on that she did not expect, and she's sort of thrown into the thick of things and trying to figure out her new job and what's going on politically and how to keep herself safe, and developing these connections to various people and meeting the emperor and trying to figure out what her predecessor got up to and why everything is falling apart, and what role she plays in it, if any. And I just felt like the ideas were so interesting. The world building had a really good foundation. It was very cool and unique. But so much of this felt like the scaffolding for an amazing story, but without being fully realized. It felt like it was sketched out and then not filled in for me. I really felt like every compelling idea or concept was dropped before it could really get interesting or really hook me or really get as deep as I wanted it to. And that also extended to the thematic content, to the characterization. I feel like despite spending this whole book with Mahit and her being our protagonist and us experiencing this through her eyes, I never really got to know her that well. And I don't feel like I got to know the other characters either very well, unfortunately. And I am a character-driven reader, so that's really important to me, and I just didn't feel it here. There is a bit of a romantic subplot. It is very much a subplot. So don't go into this expecting the romance to be a big part of the story, but it didn't do anything for me. I didn't feel like we saw enough development to really be rooting for these characters personally. I also felt like some of the thematic explorations, some of the primary ideas it seemed to be exploring about autonomy and agency and legacy, passing down memories and responsibility being laid on the future generation or those to come after, was a bit messy and muddy based on the ways that it was actually presented. It felt like the book wanted us to come away with a very clear idea, one very specific perspective on what's right and what's wrong, but I felt like the book itself was contradicting those ideas pretty frequently, and I found that a little bit confusing. I mean, I'm not confused about how I feel about it because I have opinions on everything, but I was confused about what the book was trying to say, because despite seemingly having a very clear message, I felt like the execution was not as aligned with the message as it maybe thought it was. It felt like some of the choices some of the characters made and some of the directions certain storylines went were a little bit hypocritical based on the ways the book was presenting its morality or its stance on this particular theme. I also feel like the whole system of passing down memories and experiences from one person to another is the most interesting idea in this book, and it was so underdeveloped. And then when it becomes more important to the plot, it's sort of hand-waved away. And there are aspects of it that are set up to be a really big deal and potentially really dangerous or life-altering, and then nothing happens, nothing comes of it. It's actually not a big deal at all. And I found that frustrating. I both wanted to know more about the technology, but I also wanted the technology to matter more, considering it seemed like it mattered a lot. It was a really big deal. I also think because of the way the book is structured, we actually never spend any time on the station where Mahit comes from. And so we don't get a clear, I mean, there's one scene from another character, a very short scene on the station, but otherwise everything is on this planet where the Emperor lives, the home base for the Empire. And so despite the whole book really focusing on Mahit feeling like a fish out of water, and despite the fact that she has studied the Texacolan culture her whole life, and that's part of why she is so well suited to taking over as ambassador, and she has really revered and respected their culture and wanted to be part of it. She's also a fish out of water. She has had a different lived experience. She grew up in a completely different society, in a completely different circumstance. And yet we never see that. And so it is hard for us, or I felt it was hard, because I didn't know anything really about the culture she came from. It was so underdeveloped in comparison to the Texacolan culture that it just felt like, I guess they're different, but I don't know how. And the book isn't really telling me. So that comparison, that contrast that could have been so fascinating throughout felt a little bit underbaked, at least one half of it did. And I honestly feel like it could have been very easily solved if we'd spent even a chapter or a couple chapters on the station first, experiencing what life is like there before she started her journey and arrived on the planet, so that we could actually have firsthand experience of both. Because just hearing that they're extremely different over and over again didn't really do anything for me personally. I also feel like one of the coolest things about the world building is that in this Texacolan culture, they're very focused on language and poetry, that their culture is so tied to art and to language and to specific expressions, and their language even is based on storytelling, or there are ciphers that are based on storytelling, and people communicate through poetry and through literary allusions. That is something that people bring up a lot as a benefit of the book, or something really unique and fascinating about the world building. And I would agree that conceptually it is, but it felt so underdeveloped to me. There were so many times that I really felt like it was the perfect moment to use this culture's focus on metaphor, literary allusion, poetry, meter, to enhance the situation, for subtext, for communication between certain characters, for communicating status and fluency in this culture and in this language. I just felt like so many opportunities were missed, so many stones were left unturned. I just kept waiting for it to have a bigger role in the story, and it never really did. And I found that really frustrating, because the idea is so cool and so interesting and so up my alley as a nerd about words. And I wanted so much more of that, and it just felt so underdeveloped for me personally. I was really sad about it. So many cultures on Earth are very heavily based in references and metaphors and sayings and shared stories, shared myths, fairy tales and folklore and memes even. And that is so baked into our own culture. And so it's something that all of us are familiar with. It's something that is not uncommon to us. And the way that this society was described made it seem like it was taken to 11. To 1,000. But then the way it was described felt very much like our own culture, where yeah, okay, they all have read the same great classics. They have good memories for reciting poems, but that's about it. And that was disappointing for me personally. I liked the book overall. I thought it was thought-provoking. I thought it had really cool ideas. I just didn't feel like anything quite coalesced the way I wanted it to. I didn't hate it. Maybe I just wasn't in the right place to really enjoy this in June when I read it. Maybe my expectations were just way too high based on having it recommended to me for so long, but I ended up giving A Memory Called Empire 3 stars. And I'm not against maybe trying it again in the future, or trying more Arcady Martine. I'm just that unfortunately I wasn't as taken with this as it seems a lot of people were. If you love this book, I'm so glad you loved it. I'm genuinely not trying to shit on something that you love. I promise. I'm really glad that so many people loved this. I wish I could have too. I would love to hear your thoughts on it in the comments, because maybe my mind can be swayed, and I haven't talked about it yet on my channel. So feel free to share your thoughts in the comments, because I wanted to like it more than I did. Next I read Kill the Beast by Sarah Swift, and this one I didn't really know what to expect going into it. I kind of thought it would be maybe a bit of a fun time, an easy read, a bit of a break from how much I was struggling with my reading slump, but maybe just sort of average. I ended up really liking this a lot more than I expected to. I found it very heartwarming, tender, and sweet, and wholesome, actually. I found it pretty funny. I liked the characters a lot. I thought the story was really engaging. I was very immersed in it, very taken with it. It's pretty quickly paced, and I thought the way that it handled its themes of grief and trauma was very well done and really resonated with me at times. There were some quotes in here that really got to me and made me cry. And I loved that the central relationship is a platonic friendship between these characters, and that it is such a not quite enemies to best friends, but kind of that vibe. A very unusual pairing. They end up really caring for each other, again, in a platonic way, which is not necessarily something that you come across as often as I would like. And it is a bit of a Beauty and the Beast retelling, which is kind of fun because I love Beauty and the Beast. So I'll leave it there. You can watch the reading vlog for way more detail, but I gave Kill the Beast 5 stars. I was really pleasantly surprised by it. I liked it a lot. I love the characters. The magic was cool. I hope there will be a sequel. Then I read the complete Tales and Poems of Edgar Allan Poe. This was for my Read It or Unhaul It challenge. It will be included in my next Read It or Unhaul It vlog, but that won't be for a little while because this took me over a month to read. I'm supposed to only take 2 weeks to read the books for this challenge. This one took longer. It is almost 900 pages of very small print. Literally every short story and poem that Edgar Allan Poe ever wrote, including the one novel he wrote, including book reviews, part of a play, everything. And I'm really glad I read it. I am. However, this was almost psychological torture at times, mostly for self-imposed reasons, honestly. The structure of the challenge and constantly feeling like I was falling behind, the realization that it was going to take me longer than 2 weeks to read, and then the psychological distress every day that I didn't finish it, needing to take breaks between stories, even stories that were a couple pages long, because it was just so dense. His prose is awesome. It is so overwritten in the best way. It is very descriptive, and he gets into little tangents about things that he is very excited about, and it's great. But also, I needed breaks in between. My poor little ADHD brain was fighting for its life. My remaining brain cells were at wit's end. It was great though. I loved so many of the stories. I'm so glad that I read them. It was so much fun. It was so interesting to watch his progression over time. It was so interesting to see him come back to the same ideas again and again and again from different angles, especially beautiful young women who are on the verge of death or have died and a man is obsessed with them. Which is a theme he really loved. Also, just the wide-ranging genres. He basically invented the detective novel with a couple of these short stories and created some of the conventions that we still use in the genre today. He wrote some really interesting science fiction. He wrote some satire and social commentary. Some of the stories were surprisingly hilarious. He wrote a lot of horror, which I loved. The horror stories were far and away my favorites, with just a couple exceptions, but it was hard to read nonstop. Constantly. Also, though, whoever put together this collection did not put these in a good order. I will die on that hill. The order that these are in this specific edition is diabolical, to be totally frank. Who and why would they do such a thing? I wish I could go back and read it in just a random order. It would have been better than reading multiple science fiction stories about hot air balloons in a row and then reading 5 stories about beautiful young women who are dead or dying in a row. The stories are great, but back to back to back, you can't help but compare them, and some of them are much better than others. You know, he reached the peak in certain stories, and the other ones are great. However, some of his stories are absolute masterpieces. I am giving this 5 stars, despite how much I struggled, and despite the fact that not every story in here is 5 stars by a long shot. But Edgar Allan Poe is a genius. Some of his stories are absolutely incredible. They're timeless. They are iconic. I'm very glad I read this. I am. The last book I finished in June, I might not even really say too much because I am going to be talking about it in my next video. After this one, I decided to read all of the winners, or the winners of the major categories of the Lambda Awards from 2025, which is a book award that celebrates queer authors and has awards for different categories, different identities. So I wanted to read the major winners of the fiction categories, and I've been working my way through them. I have one more to go of the ones I planned on reading, and then I'm hopefully going to review all of them for you in a video and talk about the awards. This is my first time exploring the Lambda Awards and trying to get a sense of who they are and what they celebrate and whether they're an award I want to continue following in the future. One of you recommended them to me, so thank you. So I read this for that award, and I did say that I was mostly reading fiction categories. However, this is a memoir. I did read 2 memoirs for this. This was the memoir in the bisexual memoir category, You're Embarrassing Yourself by Desiree Akhavan. I'm not the biggest memoir person, as I have said in this video already, but I did find this really interesting, especially as a bisexual myself. I have not read many, if any, memoirs of fellow bisexual people, so that was kind of interesting. And I did feel like Desiree's voice came through very strongly, and she had some really interesting stories to tell, and there was a lot of humor injected through everything, but also vulnerability, as one would hope for in a memoir. So I'll keep it brief because I'm about to talk about this more at length in my next video, but I appreciated this a lot and I gave it 4 stars. And that's the end of June. We're getting into July now. 9 more books to talk about. The first one was our book club pick for June that I read at the start of July. The Spirit Bears Its Teeth by Andrew Joseph White. I just recently read my first Andrew Joseph White when I read You Weren't Meant to Be Human in my last Read It or Unhaul It sprint. There is a reading vlog for that as well. So I was looking forward to trying more of his work, and this is one of his YA novels, which I believe had only written YA prior to You Weren't Meant to Be Human, my first adult novel. And he mostly or exclusively writes horror. So this was horror as well. Historical fiction with a speculative element and definitely heavily horror, supernatural horror. I really appreciated this quite a bit. I am not the biggest YA reader these days. I don't avoid YA, but I don't reach for it as much these days because I tend to just feel that I'm not the target audience anymore pretty strongly. But I found this very intense and visceral. This is set in an alternate Victorian England, and our protagonist is a trans boy, Silas, who is not able to live as himself because of the society he lives in. He is also autistic, and he's been sent to this facility, a boarding school and sanatorium for girls who are causing issues. And for many reasons, this is an incredibly oppressive environment for him, and he also, on top of the distress that he's in because of this abusive environment that he's in and the requirements they have of him, there is also this supernatural element. And it seems like students are going missing, that something sinister is happening underneath everything. And I felt like the depiction of Silas, of his trans experience, of his experience being autistic at a time where neither of those things would have been named or accepted at all, even though it is fantasy, it is definitely set within the Victorian norms of the era. I thought that was so well done. It was so visceral. It felt so vulnerable and real and well explored. And that's how I felt with You Weren't Meant to Be Human as well. It truly feels like Andrew Joseph White puts so much of himself into his characters and so much vulnerability and honesty. And I just can't help but deeply appreciate that as a character-driven reader. It feels impossible not to connect emotionally to these characters because they feel so real and so vivid and so fully fleshed out in every possible way. And Silas was no different. The fact that his brother had studied medicine and surgery and that Silas had been interested in it as well and studied anatomy was such an interesting aspect to this, especially when it comes to the horror elements, because Silas was able to use his medical knowledge in kind of an unexpected way, especially for a young protagonist in these kinds of situations. It came in quite handy, but it also made some of the more gory horror element scenes feel both simultaneously less scary, but also kind of more intense because of the specificity that Silas could bring to the table because of his anatomical knowledge. There's also a bit of a metaphorical framework for Silas's inner voice and self-critical voice that I found to be very interesting, a very interesting way to depict that experience. And I don't want to say too much because I don't want to spoil it for anyone, but I found that aspect of his characterization fascinating. I also felt like despite how dark this was at times, despite how hard it was to read at times, despite how much suffering there was and how much suffering Silas was going through, there were also a surprising number of wholesome, hopeful moments, and I really appreciated that because You Weren't Meant to Be Human was infinitely less hopeful. This book had some of that, and I did appreciate those moments, those glimmering moments of recognition and gender euphoria, and Silas having an experience of sort of a mirror, a reverse image mirror of his own experience through another character he meets at one point that was just so beautiful and made me cry. And I felt the way that this story explored some of its themes of dehumanization and bodily autonomy and complicity, the right to self-determination, was so well done. The book itself in its totality was not totally perfect for me, but I did think it was very well done overall. I found it incredibly interesting, and I will definitely be looking forward to reading more Andrew Joseph White. I find his stories very intense emotionally, very draining to read, but also very much worth the effort, at least in my 2 experiences so far. And I gave The Spirit Bears Its Teeth 4 stars. Next, I read another book for my Lambda Awards video, How to Fall in Love in a Time of Unnameable Disaster by Muriel Lung. And this is such a weird book. It's such a strange book. This was the winner of the Bisexual Fiction Award, and it's incredibly strange. I do enjoy strange books. I do like weird lit, but this was almost too weird for me on some level. Let me give you the premise. Basically, this is in the midst of the apocalypse. There has been the beginnings of an acid rain every Tuesday, and it's kind of destroying everything and killing a lot of people. And also ghosts have become real. And so there's a lot of people who have died because of the acid rain who are then coming back as ghosts. And our protagonist, Mira, has come back to live with her mother because things are getting worse and worse. And in doing so, she leaves her girlfriend behind who does not want to leave their apartment. And she starts a radio show to kind of process her grief over leaving her girlfriend behind, being worried about what's going to happen to her girlfriend, dealing with that separation, but also just dealing with the world ending around her. And through her radio show, she meets this man and starts a relationship with him. He happens to not have a head. She also has the ghost of her grandfather living in her apartment with her mom and herself, and also the ghost of a cockroach who is basically her best friend. And it is a strange book. What I loved about this was how weird it is, how melancholic it is, how sort of dreamlike and hazy and atmospheric it is. I also thought the book had a lot of interesting ideas, but I did feel like a lot of the surreal ideas didn't necessarily have I'm sure they had a purpose, but they didn't feel incredibly intentional. Some of them felt like, what's the weirdest thing that could happen next, you know? And sometimes it didn't really feel as intentional or as purposeful as I would have wanted it to be, or as connected thematically as I would have wanted it to be. I also believe in research after finishing it that some of these chapters were originally published as individual short stories. And it does feel like it was a collection of different writing projects, short stories that were combined into a single novel. And it does kind of feel like that in ways. It is a little bit choppy. Some sections feel a little disconnected. The pacing is a little bit uneven for me. I do think the themes were interesting ones that I personally have been reading a lot about and really appreciate. Grief, climate disaster, the queer experience, community, family, belonging. So many of them were, touched on at points that were definitely present throughout the narrative, but not necessarily as deeply explored as I would have liked. And I think the same goes for the characterization. I honestly feel like the character with the most characterization was the cockroach ghost. And I liked that character a lot. Shockingly. The ending was a little bit unsatisfying for me. It felt like it left too many things open. Again, I don't mind an open ending, but there were just so many things that were built up to and so many questions that were brought up that we just then never got an answer to. There were some things that were very strange and surreal. And the whole book is, but some of them were extra strange and surreal. And I wondered why and how, and it was a bit distracting. So I admired aspects of the novel. I found parts of it interesting. I didn't dislike my experience reading it, but I felt like it didn't quite come together for me. So I ended up giving this one 3 stars. Then I read our quarterly buddy read pick, Butter by Asako Yuzuki, and unfortunately this wasn't for me, and I do think this might be a me thing, so I'll put that out there. I think a lot of people will like this. A lot of people in the buddy read in our discussion enjoyed this more than I did. So again, your mileage may vary. For me personally, the combination of a number of things did not end up working for me. And part of it is just that I do not particularly enjoy reading books about food that are really focused on describing food or centrally about food. I just don't find it interesting on the one hand. It just doesn't appeal to me. But also on the second hand, most of those books are not also vegan. And as a vegan of 14 or 15 years now, I don't even know. I don't like reading about people constantly eating and preparing and talking about non-vegan food. It just, I realize most people in the world are not vegan and, that has nothing to do with me. But I usually don't prefer to read books about it. Just like I wouldn't watch a cooking show of people cooking non-vegan food, I typically would not choose to read a book about it either. However, it seemed like the subject matter might be interesting outside of that, and it was voted on. I don't decide what books we read. We decide as a group, and the group decided. So I thought I would step outside of my comfort zone and perhaps I would be pleasantly surprised. However, this was not for me. So the basic premise is that we're following our protagonist, who is a journalist, Rika, and she is trying to get access to a infamous serial killer, or supposed alleged serial killer, Kaji, who has been accused of dating and murdering multiple men. And part of her MO was caring for them, being the perfect housewife sort of figure, cooking them these elaborate meals. She was known to have gone to a fancy cooking class for fancy ladies who want to learn to cook. And Rika wants to write a story on her. She wants to get access to her in prison, awaiting trial. and she manages to get in to interview her. And the book follows their interviews, their developing relationship, Rika's understanding of and experience of food shifting significantly under this influence, and going from someone who kind of ate the same thing every day and didn't think about food too much to someone who is very much becoming a foodie and learning to cook and getting really involved in food. It's also based on a real story in Japan and a real serial killer. So that also seemed interesting to me. But I would say that the serial killer angle, the murderers angle, is not nearly as big of a part of this book as I expected going into it. It is much more about Rika exploring food, becoming a foodie, cooking, and again, that is not my thing at all. I also personally did not love the way that the book handled talking about weight gain and bodies in general. I didn't love how the novel handled its themes. I found them a little bit overworked and maybe a little trite. A lot, it felt like the central idea was about nourishing yourself and food as community and care for other people, and how you really should enjoy every meal you ever eat, and every bite you put in your mouth, you should only eat things that bring you new experiences and are lush and rich and, worth tasting. And I just, I mean, food is great, I love food. I do. I enjoy eating it a lot. However, as someone who has never been a good cook and doesn't like preparing food, my style of ADHD makes cooking excruciating for me. Very stressful, timing everything, trying to get things done at the right time, having things in the pan long enough so that they're cooked but not burnt while something else is preparing somewhere else. It is a lot for me. It's very stressful, and I'm not good at it. I also, again, of course, don't find a lot of the things that were being described at length, repeatedly ad nauseum in this book, including butter, to be appealing, personally. And there is a scene of preparing a whole turkey that I found honestly pretty disturbing in the way it was described. So for me personally, this was not for me. It felt like the ways it engaged with various topics felt quite surface level. The ethics of food, nutrition, fat phobia, trauma, classism was not really engaged with, despite the fact that having access to these incredibly high quality ingredients and being able to go to fancy cooking classes and so on, all of this is very much class dependent. And the book occasionally touched on class, but then sort of skirted away from it. There was also a bit of a side plot with another character doing something that felt so out of character and revealing things about the character that just felt out of left field that then didn't go anywhere and just kind of disappeared again. I thought that was strange. I feel like our serial killer character, who was kind of the draw, I think, the way that the book is described really emphasizes this cooking beautiful meals and then murdering the men sort of character. And she is much more minor than I expected her to be, and I felt like her characterization was pretty one note. I also felt like the way that her body was described, she is described explicitly as fat, and the book spends a lot of time focusing on her body and objectifying her and making her body overtly sexual, and she is sexualizing herself but also being sexualized by other characters, including Rika, who apparently is straight. Could have fooled me. But I didn't love how her body was talked about. I didn't love how bodies and body image and fat phobia were handled in general in this book, and I do realize there is some level of cultural difference. Also, this book was originally published not only in Japan, but also a decade ago, roughly. So it has only recently been translated into English. It does feel a little bit outdated to me personally in some of those areas and the ways that it's talking about bodies. And then there's also the context of this novel coming out at the time that this news story of the real story this is based on was in the news, and people having more context for that. And in some ways I felt like the author was relying on her Japanese audience knowing this story and pulling more details from the real news to fill in the scaffolding of this serial killer character that wasn't really as alleged serial killer character that wasn't as fleshed out as I would have expected based on how the book was marketed. I just felt like the plot was very slow. It was pretty meandering. I didn't love how the ideas were handled, and I just didn't enjoy reading the food descriptions at all. So that was Butter. Unfortunately, this was a 1-star read for me. Again, I fully acknowledge that it might be a me thing. This might just not be a book for me, whereas it might be amazing for other people. I think it is for a lot of people. A lot of people love this book. I did not, personally. I also found it a little bit triggering at times, the way that it talked about bodies. So if you have a history of eating disorders, I would be a little bit careful with this one, personally. Next up, I read Dungeon Crawler Carl by Matt Dinneman. I made a reading vlog for this, so I get into way more detail over there. What I will say is, again, might just be me, but this was not for me. The humor did not work for me. I did not love how this book handled its themes. This is a lit RPG about our everyman dude who loves video games and his girlfriend's cat, who is there when aliens come and destroy the Earth. And his option is freeze outside in his boxers or enter into the dungeon and start fighting for his life on national or international or intergalactic alien TV. And I personally did not appreciate how the themes were being explored and depicted. I had qualms, especially with the first boss. Watch the reading vlog for way more detail on that. I also just didn't find it funny. The humor didn't work for me. I didn't like the writing style. It was very repetitive, both with the lit RPG structure and the constant achievements and so on, and giving us many info dumps and then repeating information ad nauseum, but also just the prose itself on a sentence by sentence level was very repetitive. It just didn't capture me. I wasn't drawn to Carl as a protagonist. I didn't have a fun time. But again, lots of people love this book, so your mileage may vary. You may have a great time with it. Watch my reading vlog for way more detail on this, because it's a long video. I really went into detail, and I did try to give this book the benefit of the doubt. I did want to like it. It just from the beginning was not for me, and despite pushing through and hoping for the best, it just never won me over personally. I think this book sort of sinks or swims based on whether you find it entertaining and whether you can laugh at it. And because it wasn't aligned with my personal sense of humor, it wasn't a very good time for me personally. So I ended up giving Dungeon Crawler Carl 2 stars. Next, I read a very long trilogy from Robin Hobb, part of the Realm of the Elderling series. I read the Liveship, Traders, Trilogy, Ship of Magic, Mad Ship, and Ship of Destiny. I did read it for a reading vlog. Oh my god, this is impossible to hold. Try to give you a general sense of my feeling on the trilogy as a whole, and you can go watch the reading vlog for individual reviews. You can skip over the spoilers if you want, obviously, of course. For me, this didn't quite reach the heights of the Farseer trilogy. The Farseer trilogy, I believe I ended up giving it 4 stars, 5 stars, 5 stars. I was very emotionally impacted by it, very invested, even though I had criticisms of all 3, and there were things that I wanted more of, especially complex female characters. I really enjoyed it. I thought the world building was great. The characterization was fantastic. The plot went in directions I didn't expect. The Fool was my favorite character that I've read in a very long time. So I had high hopes for Liveship. I had heard a number of people say they thought I might appreciate this trilogy even more than Farseer. Unfortunately, not quite. I ended up giving it 3 stars, 4 stars, 4 stars. I did obviously like it a lot, but the first book was very much a lot of setup, a lot of getting us ready for the rest of the trilogy, and it's 900 pages, so that's a lot to ask. There is quite a bit of character development through the series. The characters all go on a huge journey, and I did end up loving a number of them, but the first book was rough because I hated pretty much every character. All the characters were kind of the worst in the first book. This was a slog to get through. Even though the world building is cool, even though the magic is fantastic, I love the idea of these ships that have a consciousness and come alive and carry the memories of the people who have lived and died on their decks. But it was rough for me. The second book picked up quite a bit, and the third book continued in that vein, was much more fast-paced for me. I was more invested in the characters. Some of the characters, like Malta, had such amazing development and became just incredible characters that I was really rooting for. But I did struggle with a couple of the choices made, especially near the end of the third book, and was feeling kind of on the fence in general, despite the fact that there were many more female characters in this book, and I did feel by the end that many of them were given complex, layered arcs. There was so much misogyny in these books, and a lot of it is intentional and being critiqued by the books. But there were also some 90s-isms, throwaway lines, and plot lines, and ways that certain characters were handled that felt like a little bit of internalized, sort of unexamined bias slipping through that I didn't love. And again, I go into way more detail in the reading vlog. I ended up liking this a lot, even if I didn't love it quite as much as Farseer, and I will continue on in this series. I'm looking forward to Tawny Man. I've only heard amazing things, so I'm excited to move forward, but I think that's all I will say, because these books are massive and there's so much I could say, and I have said so much already, but that's sort of the overview, I guess, of how this went. The second last book I'm going to talk about in this video was Pretty by KB Brookins. This is another memoir and another book that I picked up for the Lambda Awards. This was memoir written by a trans author, and this is about KB's experience through childhood to young adulthood, and I was very impacted by this. I cried several times. We have sort of regular memoir chapters interspersed with poetry, and that was a really interesting format, and I really appreciated KB's vulnerability and openness and being able to read their experiences. KB is non-binary, and it was really fascinating and heartbreaking at times, many of the times, to follow their story and to experience their life along with them. And again, I'm not much of a memoir reader, but I really felt like this was worth the time and very impactful. And even if you're not typically a memoir reader, I think this was worth the read. I mean, I had 3 memoirs that I read in these 2 months, and all 3 of them are memoirs that I would definitely recommend. For me, Pretty was a 4-star read, and I'll talk about it more in my next video. And finally, last but not least, I read Night of the Mannequins by Oh, I don't know if you could hear that. It's thunderstorming. I saw some lightning, but that was loud thunder. We're on our last book, and it is a horror novella, so the thunder is kind of perfect. I read Night of the Mannequins by Stephen Graham Jones. I've enjoyed several Stephen Graham Jones works in the past, and I was really excited to read this one. I have always found Mannequins creepy since the reboot of Doctor Who, and that first episode, if you know, you know. Spooky. So I was really excited to read this. It was not what I expected, though. This went in directions that I did not expect. I found it to be a tough read for a variety of reasons, and I really don't want to spoil it for you, so I'm going to try to be very vague about this, but it was creepy and unsettling, but overall it left me feeling more sad than anything. And I think it's pretty straightforward, but it did leave me with some questions that I felt were not really examined. I ended up with a bit of mixed feelings about how the protagonist, I ended up with some mixed feelings about how mental illness is handled in this story, and I think that that can be a tough thing to talk about in horror. I do think a lot of horror and thrillers and mystery can lean on harmful stereotypes of mental illness to pin their stories on. I don't think this is intentionally trying to do that. I came away from it feeling very mixed about how a particular character was portrayed, and I'm not an expert. I'm not a mental health professional. I can't say whether it did a good job or not definitively, but I was not sure how to feel about it. I also felt like the campiness and the sort of silly 80s movie, almost humorous tone did not really blend with the subject matter particularly well. And I know some people love that. I personally don't really tend to love my horror mixed with humor. It can work in very particular cases for me, but if a book is meant to be horrifying, I want it to be horrifying. If a book is meant to be humorous, I want it to be humorous, and never the twain shall meet, generally. For me personally, the tonal shifts didn't quite work, again, for me personally. I think the ending had a pretty intense emotional impact, but overall the reading experience left me pretty conflicted. I think just for me personally, this is not one of my favorites of Stephen Graham Jones' work. I think he has much, much better work, or work that is much, much more to my taste. I ended up giving this 3 stars. I'm still sort of on the fence. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts if you've read Night of the Mannequins and how it landed with you and how you felt about how it handles mental illness. Love the concept, love using mannequins for horror, will always find mannequins creepy. Having worked in retail and having had to go to the basement to grab stock, and there just being piles of unused mannequins in the corner that are kind of in the dark, spooky shadows, it's always scary. They're terrifying. But this wasn't quite what I hoped for. And that brings us to the end of this video. I feel like it was kind of a mixed bag. Like I said, I felt like I was constantly fighting a reading slump through these months, and I had a lot of other things on my mind and a lot of other things to deal with. So it kind of feels like a fever dream, but I did find a number of new favorites. I had some really great reading experiences, so definitely not a total wash, and hopefully this wrap-up was helpful for you if you're thinking about reading any of these. Again, don't forget to check out the description box if you want longer, more detailed reviews of the vast majority of these, because most of these have been included in other videos, so they'll all be linked down below. So that I know that you're a real one and made it all the way to the end, leave an emoji down below representing one of the books that I reviewed in this video. I'll try to guess which book it is. I'm kind of terrible at this game, but I find it fun, so let's keep it going. Like this video if you liked it, subscribe if you haven't already, hype this video up if you're on mobile, and I'll see you really soon in my next one. Bye, friends.